consciousness is the starting point of reality.
Completely antithetical to that attitude in science.
What is reality?
We're now at this great inflection.
Video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today.
The whole point of a virtual reality is to have useful fiction of causality.
The individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual.
Space-time is doomed.
Consciousness is fundamental.
Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise.
Balance is not the ability to stand up, it's the ability to rise up.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
We're here again with another conversation. And what we slightly talked about last time was that we wanted to maybe probe more into the relationship between the horizontal and the vertical consciousness. But I'm actually really interested in how you, from a scientific perspective, explains how consciousness becomes matter. Because, from the spiritual perspective, as I have briefly explained, it's about resistance. But, from your perspective, what have you been able to figure out so far?
Right. So the idea is that standardly, my colleagues in the sciences have assumed that space-time is the fundamental nature of reality, space-time and its contents. So space-time and energy fields and particles, and then groups of particles that we call atoms and molecules and organisms and objects. And now many physicists are saying that space-time is doomed and that there's a deeper reality beyond space-time that gives rise to space-time as a mathematical projection. So the idea is going to be that what we call space-time and matter is a mathematical projection of some deeper reality outside of space-time. Now, of course...
But my question is, because we've already talked about that, my question is, how does it happen?
Right. So I was just trying to give the background of what my physicist friends are doing, but and so they don't endorse what I'm about to say, which is my ideas about consciousness, right? I just wanted to put it in the context.
Sure.
So what I'm proposing is that consciousness is the fundamental nature of objective reality. And space-time and physical objects are data structures or perceptions within consciousness. And so for that, we have to have a mathematically precise theory of consciousness and how it operates. And then we still have to do the same kind of mathematical operation that I was describing that the physicists are doing, which is to show how the dynamics of consciousness, which is outside of space and time entirely. Right? It's much, much more complicated and many, many more levels than space-time. It's far, far richer. How that dynamics gets projected into space-time. And there I'm looking for a completely precise mathematical model. And that's literally what I'm working on even this morning before we get on. So that's what we're working on right now. So the idea would be that what we call, for example, particles, like gluons, which are among the constituents of protons and neutrons, will be representations within consciousness of certain aspects of the dynamics of conscious agents. And I mean, if you want, we can go into more precisely what the mathematics is, but the idea will be so. For example, the physicists will standardly tell you, this is now not just my idea by any means, this is standard among physicists, that what we call particles are what they call irreducible representations of the Poincare group. And what that is, so the Poincare group is a description of the symmetries of space-time. So rotation, translation, Lorentz invariance, and which is remarkable, because what they're saying is that the particles themselves are representations of the symmetries of space.
Right.
And when we see particles moving through space, we're actually now this is in their point of view, we're seeing sort of the energy of the vacuum sort of going, what they say, on shell, where the energy and the momentum, for example, in massless particles are identical, and we see things traveling through space-time for massless particles at the speed of light. But the idea now switching from what the physicists standardly say to this idea about consciousness, it will be that we understand this vertical and horizontal dynamics of consciousness in its full richness, and then certain conscious agents, to simplify that complexity, right? We can't deal with all the vertical and horizontal complexity of consciousness. We have to dumb it down in a way that we can understand. And for example, I'm interacting with you right now and your consciousness. There are countless other consciousnesses available. How do I focus in on you and not get distracted about the countless other ones? Well, I have a user interface that is a projection of the horizontal and vertical complexity of all these consciousness interacting, that allows me to, in some sense, simplify that and focus in on a particular consciousness, namely your consciousness right now, and interact with that consciousness. And so the idea then is that matter is not a fundamental entity. This is now from my point of view, not what the physicists say.
Right.
That it's something that it's a data structure that we create on the fly. So just like, I think a good analogy is, which we've talked about briefly before, is that if you're in a virtual reality game and you have a VR headset on, like you're playing Grand Theft Auto, if I look over and I see a red Ferrari, I'm creating that red Ferrari on the fly in my consciousness. It's a structure only in my consciousness. And when I turn my head away and look over here, now I see a green Mustang. I have literally destroyed the red Ferrari. That doesn't even exist anymore. Now it's a green Mustang that exists in my consciousness. Now, if you're playing the game and you're looking over, you might create your own red Ferrari, but your red Ferrari is in your consciousness. But there's no such thing as an objective red Ferrari out there. So that's the key thing. Most of us think about, like, physical objects like the moon, as of course they're there when no one looks. They always exist. They have their own existence on their own, independent of perception. And so in this new approach in which consciousness is fundamental, the moon is an experience that I have in consciousness when I choose to act in certain ways, and I render that experience. But when I choose to act in other ways, now I'm rendering something else. Now I'm rendering the sun, or I'm rendering a mountain. But these things don't exist independent of me.
Right. And this to me is quite interesting, because in spiritual tradition, this in many ways has been the premise of how we see the world. Relating to it as a projection of one's own consciousness, and also saying that nothing can exist outside the experience of it, and that the outer world therefore does not exist. But what is difficult for most people to grasp is that if I place an apple on the table and other people also see the same apple, and they say, like, that apple exists, but according to a kind of spiritual way of thinking, it actually does not, because it's a collective experience being created. And this brings me back to resistance and understanding. This is also why I asked you how this happens, because the model of resistance basically explains how consciousness is being turned into manifested reality and how it can be experienced. But the principle of resistance states that it's not possible for anything to exist outside the experience, because the one experiencing or observing it is the author of the object, which means that when, for instance, you look at the moon and it's there, and you look away and everyone will say it's still there. It's because it's then also part of collective experience. It's not only collective experience of humans, but it's also collective. It's part of the collective experience in the universe. So there are many levels of collective consciousness in action at the same time, both horizontally and vertically, which means that as long as somebody is experiencing that object as a mirror of the projection of that observer's consciousness, it has to exist. And as I also said last time, without it, it cannot exist. So basically, existence is, both individual and collective renderings. So when you leave a space, it means that on many different levels, this might be a key ingredient in a collective experience or collective narrative, a building block, which means that it will still exist as part of that collective projection. But when you are not observing it, that manifestation will slightly change, because when you are not part of the experience of it, that the kind of like source code to that manifestation will change, because it's the result of everyone observing it at the same time. So this is also why understanding dimensionality, resistance, vertical and horizontal consciousness are keys to how this whole thing operates. But I think, for many people, it's a stretch to accept that the outer world does not really exist beyond the individual and collective projections. So how do you kind of sell that also to the scientific community?
Right. I think that there's an analogy that's accessible to most people that really, in some sense, turns this around and turns it from something that you go, that's impossible. It can't be that way. It can't be that I create objects, because if I don't look at the apple and turn my head away, you can still see the apple, right? And so clearly the apple must exist. Or if I take the apple and I don't look at it and I drop it, I know that if I turn my head back, I know where the apple's going to be, and so I can predict that. And so there's an analogy, I think, that will make that just obvious that that it's possible that we're creating what we see. And it's again in virtual reality. So suppose that you decide to play a game of virtual tennis with somebody. So you put on your headset and bodysuit, and you find yourself immersed on a tennis court with a net, and you see the avatar of your friend across the net, and you pick up a yellow tennis ball, and you hit it with your racket, and your friend hits it back to you, and you start playing with the tennis ball. So you both talk about the tennis ball, and you're both hitting the tennis ball. But strictly speaking, you know that the tennis ball that you see is just something that you create because of your headset and the rendering that you do in your own headset, and that your friend on the other side of the court doesn't even have the same headset on that you have. And if you turn your headset away, you don't see the tennis ball. So you might say, look, I can prove that this tennis ball really exists, this VR tennis ball. I'm not going to look at the tennis ball, and I'm going to ask my friend, does she still see it? And they can say, yeah, I still see it. And you can say, well, that proves that there really is a real tennis ball. Well, no, I don't see it because I'm not rendering it. My friend sees it because she's just turning her headset in such a way that she's getting the right pixels to her headset, and she then in her consciousness is creating a tennis ball. And you can, in anything that you could do, all the standard examples that we give that prove that the moon is there or the tennis ball is there when no one's looking, just think about doing that in virtual reality with a friend with the headset and bodysuit on. You'll get the same answer that you would get, and you realize that the VR context makes it clear that at least it's possible that we're creating this stuff on the fly and deleting it just as we turn our headsets around. And that's what I'm claiming. The VR case is actually true about everyday life. Space-time, as I perceive it now, and all the objects are the VR that I'm creating right now. And if I don't happen to look at the apple, then I'm not creating it. But if you say I still see the apple, well, that's because you're creating it in your headset. And people will often go, well, look, that doesn't hold water because you can reach over and touch it. So yeah, I don't see the apple, but if you close your eyes and reach over and touch it, you'll feel it. So that proves the apple was there all along. And again, no, that the experience of touch is also your creation. You create everything that you touch. And so you could have, again, a bodysuit, a VR bodysuit, where you have haptic feedback. So that your haptic feedback is giving you the feeling of the racket in your hand and the hitting of the ball and also picking up the tennis ball. And so the feedback itself from touch is, again, a virtual reality that you create when you interact, and you don't create it when you're not interacting. And so that's one analogy that I think will, if people think about, let me put it this way. I think for our generation, this might be hard to grasp, the idea that we create what we see. But I think 15, 20 years from now, the generation that's raised where they spend a good part of their day in VR worlds, this is going to be just like trivial. They're going to go, how could our, our parents and grandparents have had any trouble with it? It's just obvious that we're creating this stuff when we look, and we don't create it when we don't. It's just, I think these ideas will be, in some sense, just, trivial to the next generation because they'll just be living in VR for so much more time than we have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this also explains dimensionality. As I've explained, that dimensionality is also the result of the strings according to your level of consciousness. And it basically means that what you project and therefore what you observe changes with your consciousness. So, we all assume in a way that we have the same experiences, and it's based on kind of the same building blocks. But as we expand what we call spiritually, which basically is that the consciousness in the kind of experience incarnation is expanding, it means that the very kind of time space that you live in and how you experience it will change. And it means that you can interact with life in a very different way, and also how you see things will change. And this, if you're not really on board with this sounds like philosophy, but it's actually hard fact in the way that you start expanding how you sense, how you analyze that kind of data information and the renderings that you create based on the projection of consciousness. So one can be in what seems to be the same space, observing the same object, and yet it will be two different spaces and two different objects. And that distance will be greater and greater based on the difference in level of consciousness. And I think this is also something that people gradually will accept. And I think this way of thinking will completely transform human sciences.
Right. I certainly agree, and I think that there's a way for people to see that idea and for it to make sense to them, and that is that in very prosaic ways, everyday kinds of things. So I'm watching a tennis match on television, and I watch, and I'm no tennis pro or anything like that, but I'm having a good time watching the game. And then the announcer points out something. They're looking at the same thing I'm looking at, but they point out something about the serve or the footwork of the person. And I realize, whoa, this person is looking at the same game, but what they're seeing is utterly different from me because they know how to see and I don't. Or listening to music. If I'm listening to some classical music, again, being inexpert, I have my level of understanding and enjoyment. But when I talk with a real musician and they start pointing out the subtleties and so forth, I realize, oh, this person, we're being exposed to the same thing, but they're living in a far richer world of experience. Or even someone who's an expert at wines, right? I take a sip of wine and it tastes great to me. And then someone else who's like a connoisseur, they taste it and they start talking about, oh, well, this came from such and such a region and has these subtleties. And I realize once again that we're tasting the same chemicals, but the world of our experience is utterly different. And we see that anytime that there's, as we get an expertise, so a mathematician, I look at an equation, looks like a mess to me, and a mathematician who has studied that will look at it and go, oh, wow, that's beautiful. This is all the connections that it has. So we have this, so we know that in some sense, as we become more engaged in a particular area, as we study, as we play more tennis or whatever it might be, study wines or music or so forth, we're building deeper and deeper perceptual systems, and we're actually going into a richer and richer world of consciousness in that area. And so we see this in the sort of small things of everyday life. I think that you're pointing out that this goes on in even bigger and deeper ways.
Yes, because that will be my point, because everything you're describing is what we refer to as horizontal expansion.
Right.
It's basically, you're relating to the same space, the same manifestation, but you have a richer, and more kind of textured experience, but still of the same object. Now, it's once you go into the vertical expansion, the very space and therefore the premise and the math of time-space changes. It's basically saying that when you listen to classical music, when you go into the vertical, there will be more instruments. The symphony will be longer. It's a different piece. Where the piece that you listen to included, but it's just a small part of it. So you get a bigger contextual experience where there is more, and maybe even what you are listening to in that horizontal level is not even the main part of it. So it changes on a more fundamental way. And this is why, understanding the difference between the vertical and the horizontal is so kind of fundamental to kind of explore consciousness and physics.
Right. Absolutely. Now, I agree that there are this you can have actually a richer language, and so to speak. So in the vertical dimension, there's literally new adjectives, new predicates that you didn't have at the lower level, and so and there can be degrees of this. It could be a minor augmentation of the predicates that you have, or it could be a total overhaul that you have to have a completely new language altogether. We see this again in some simple fun cases like in visual perception. I can show you some dots moving on a screen. And if they're just sort of moving randomly, you just see a two-dimensional motion of these dots. But if I program the dots with a certain algorithm where they're satisfying certain algebraic equations in their motion, some quadratic equations, all of a sudden your experience will literally move into a new dimension. Instead of seeing a two-dimensional motion of dots, you will all of a sudden experience a three-dimensional object like a sphere.
Yes.
And I can make you see anything that I want. If we know how this works. And we see this all the time in visual perception, for example, that you can be stuck like in a two-dimensional plane and only seeing things in two dimensions, but when you get the right change in the stimulus, then all of a sudden a literal new dimension of experience happens. So in one case is three-dimensional objects. Another case is what we call subjective surfaces, where you're not seeing a surface at all. You're just seeing dots or whatever, or lines, and all of a sudden you see a glowing surface. When we have just the right thing, all of a sudden a new kind of predicate is required, a new description that was not. So the funny thing is, I've shown you exactly the same kind of thing, like dots moving on a screen. It's just when I change how they move a little bit, all of a sudden a new language is required to describe the new dimension of your experience. And this is, again, in some sense trivial, it's just in perception, but I think these concrete examples sort of help to get the idea that we can go to more and more richer conscious experiences.
Yeah.
But I think you're also pointing to something even deeper than that, which is we may need to go to places where all of our current predicates are no longer appropriate, and we need entirely new set of predicates. And that's a much deeper move. And I think that's also quite possible.
Yes, absolutely, because it's, one of the spiritual principles when it comes to how kind of existence is engineered in a way is that, you cannot have a fractal or a detail without it knowing what it's part of, because, that's the math in a way. So like even the smallest particle will have to, in a way, carry the code of the whole. Otherwise, it could not be a part of the whole. So even though when we kind of fractalize, when things are kind of split into smaller manifestations, it means that they're still connected. And it means that the small particle needs to have the full information of everything in order to exist. Because otherwise, it could not kind of exist with precision. And it means that in every level of horizontal existence, you will still have the cookie crumbs that will lead you to kind of the next level of what we call defractalization, because each level is, in a way, kind of closer to that reality of oneness. Often I describe expanded levels of awareness as contextual consciousness, because it simply means that there is more information connected and you can see it operate as one. And that kind of just continues to grow. And you see this both in different forms of dimension and expression, but you see it more and more as an organism, and you're able to relate to it in the same way. And I explained this, when you learn how to play the piano, you start with one finger, and you can play, simple melody lines, but over time you learn how to use both your hands, and your fingers will operate individually. But at the same time, you operate them as an individual, and you play a piece of music, you play whole chords. And that is the expression of the music. It's not just one finger anymore. So it goes from being kind of like linear and one finger at a time into being a more kind of full expression through the fractalization away through your fingers. So it's always possible to use whatever level of horizontal reality you're in and kind of mathematically understand what the next level is, because it's already part of it. Now, to do that, we need to be in a vertical state of consciousness, because when we are like in the horizontal mind, we are in a way a product of that horizontal reality, and we're not able to think, feel, or experience beyond it. I've often described the DNA as the barrier. It's the vertical being projected through the DNA, and then you have the physical consciousness. So you have to go through that barrier into the vertical signals, which means that you are able to observe life as math. You can see the principles. You can see how this operates. It's basically, I say it's kind of like just like on stage. You have the performance, and then you go behind the curtain, and then you see the whole production, and that's more the vertical. So you have to go into that, and that's how you can relate to that kind of more upward expansion, which is more mathematical. And that's also when we get these enormous like insights and revelations. And many people have experienced this through spiritual practices. And they, in that state, they can have enormous insight. And the moment they go through the DNA barrier again, they don't understand what they understood, because the human mind is then still limited by the DNA. So it's like using spiritual practices, and I'm sure over time humans will find different ways, maybe better ways to do it through technology, but go through that barrier and enable the mind to go kind of behind, backstage into the production and see the math and see the mechanics and relate to it directly, not having to go through projection first, because it's almost impossible to understand the kind of production, understand the math of the projection when you are in it. You have to go backstage. And that's kind of going beyond that DNA barrier into the pure vertical state, because that it's the information level of existence. And it's also part of who we are. And that's the thing. Socially, we only accept in horizontal, but spiritually, we are also vertical beings. And we exist in a pure mathematical state when we are in that kind of pure alignment. And things make sense in a very different way, and you can understand the projection. So, what I try to do is, assist people also in science to try to go through that barrier and connect with the vertical, because also, for instance, in the world of mathematics or physics, it changes how your mind operates. And you can explore in a very, very different way, because this is really kind of, the production of the projected experience. And to me, this is where also scientists kind of need to go, because as I said, like when we are still within the horizontal consciousness, we're not able to operate outside of it. We're not able to think and understand, because our minds will be part of the horizontal mathematics. So it will be kind of an enclosed logic, and we'll interpret everything based on that state of reality. So we need to kind of free ourselves. And in spiritual traditions, when you look at all spiritual traditions, this is something they have all attempted to do. So there's been some kind of collective intuition around the understanding of that kind of barrier being real. But I see it clearly as the DNA, because that also vibrates. It's kind of like the vibrational code that then is interpreted into biology. And it is possible to go through it. But you then need to also get to know yourself beyond this form as a horizontal being. And that takes for someone also to kind of connect with that and be open to the idea that we are living consciousness, and we project that consciousness into form to have limited experience in specific sets of collective reality. But even when it comes to collective reality, and this is something many people can realize and can relate to when it comes to altered states of consciousness. Even in this horizontal reality, there are many different levels. And if you think of that as kind of different floors in a building, it means when you are on the ground floor, you will interact with the people kind of living on that floor. And also in life, when you are in a specific type of consciousness, the other people, being part of that same kind of collective main field of consciousness, those are the ones that will be interacting with you. Those are the ones you meet. Those are the ones you bump into. The manifestations that can mirror that consciousness, that's what you notice. That's what you will be interacting with. And many people experience this very concretely when they go through transformations in life. It's like going up to a different level, and all of a sudden, It's the whole thing. Like the kind of stage set of one's life has changed, and the whole cast has changed as well. And you interact with different people and different settings and different manifestations because you now operate on a different variation, but it's still within the same kind of main collective experience of this horizontal reality. So even, I refer to this as an octave. So when we have a collective experience, it's still within an octave, but there are still kind of different levels within it. So I think it's so fascinating today that we've come to this point where spiritual experience, spiritual knowledge can start kind of merging into science, and that science can also kind of merge into spirituality. I'm a little bit conflicted in a way by the term spirituality, because to me, there is only reality. And then there is the experience of it and the exploration of it. And spirituality to me often implies that there is something that is not spiritual, that is somewhere else. To me, everything exists in the same kind of non-space. It is in that absolute ocean, and the rest is projection and experience. And the term spirituality can be limiting in the way that we have created so many collective belief systems about what that is. My approach is simply exploring what is, and doing that through kind of my own journey, my own expressions, and kind of learning how to probe, how to be an explorer. And that is basically what science is doing too. But science has developed a methodology to test and retest and retest. And I think that combination can be extremely fruitful.
I certainly agree. I think that science, like your description of spirituality, really is about exploring what is. And science over the last 400 years has developed these incredible tools that humanity has never had before. The tools of mathematical precision, careful experiments, and then the cycle of experiments, testing theories, and then taking the theories to new levels. So that one reason I'm, engaged in these conversations and delighted by these conversations is because I think that the ideas that the spiritual traditions have had for thousands of years are now, for the first time, some scientists are opening up to the possibility of exploring those ideas with these rigorous tools that they've developed. The barrier has been that we as scientists have taken space-time to be fundamental. Anything outside of space-time we could call, supernatural or spiritual or whatever, and sort of dismiss it that way. I'm not saying that all scientists, of course, dismiss these things, but I'm saying that there was this physicalist bent toward science that tended to dismiss anything that isn't inside space and time and isn't a product of matter and energy operation within space-time. But now that scientists, using their own tools, have realized that space-time can't be fundamental, and their own methodology is telling them that they need to find they need to go vertical now. Space-time has been an incredibly good horizontal framework, and for 400 years they've become really expert at developing the tools of science, math and experiment and theory, to explore that.